Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. It is July 13th, 2023. Hard to believe we're halfway through the year already, and we are here to discuss the anatomy of a data breach, dissecting common threats, compliance hurdles, and the financial impact of cyber attacks. If this is your first time joining us for an Omega Systems webinar, welcome. My name is Kaylee Alessandro. I'm the Director of Marketing for Omega. We're an award-winning MSP and MSSP with more than 20 years of IT, cybersecurity, and compliance experience. Omega is frequently recognized by well-respected channel and vertical market publications for our premier managed services, consistent commitment to customers, and impressive growth and operational performance. And just this year, we were ranked number 51 among 501 global MSPs by Channel Futures. I also want to thank our co-sponsor of today's events, our friends at Covelo. Covelo helps businesses proactively reduce cybersecurity risk and achieve compliance with automated data discovery, classification, and reporting. Its cloud-compatible data protection platform continuously scans, identifies, classifies, and reports on sensitive data across the organization, simplifying compliance reporting and risk remediation. So thanks to Covelo for joining us today. Now, of course, I want to introduce you to our esteemed speakers who are joining me here today. We're excited to welcome Will McKean, a special agent with the FBI's Cyber Crimes Task Force, James Menaka, CEO of Covelo, and my colleague Ben Turcha, who is Omega Systems' newly appointed COO. Gentlemen, welcome. I'm going to go around the horn and ask each of you to share a little bit about yourself and your background. So, Will, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Good morning, everybody. I guess good afternoon. Again, my name is Will McKean. I'm a special agent here in the New York office of the FBI, where I work on our Financial Cyber Crimes Task Force, specifically focused on financially motivated cyber crimes, insider threats, and cyber-enabled frauds. I'm also a cyber instructor for the FBI and a member of our crisis or hostage negotiation team, depending on what generation you're in. We have both of those names. And happy to be here to talk about this with you guys today.
Awesome. We're excited to have you here. James, how about you?
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for having me here today. So my name is James McNack. I've been in the cyber space for just over 15 years, really started in the deep packet inspection space and MDR, and then vulnerability management, where I've founded multiple companies in that space, and now Covelo in the attack surface management space.
Awesome. We're glad to have you. And Ben?
Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks for hosting this. It's great to be with everyone today. Ben Turcha, I'm the COO of Omega Systems, newly appointed as of July, as Kaylee said. I've been with the company for 17 years, started my career as a network engineer, and then really moved into service delivery management, product development, and just ensuring our organization delivers products to our customers and we keep everyone ahead of the pace of the attackers and solutions meet the needs of our clients. So happy to be here, looking forward to our discussion, and let's get going.
All right. Well, thank you all again for joining. We've got a lot to cover for sure, and I'm certain that we'll use as much time as we are able to today. I usually cover a few quick logistics before we dive in. So we have allocated 60 minutes for today's discussion. We're going to do our best to stick within that window, be respectful of everybody's time, while hoping to keep some time at the end for Q&A. That said, you are welcome to submit questions at any time during the webinar by using the questions box on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll do our best to address as many of those as we are able. As always, we are recording today's webinar, so you'll be able to revisit this content or share it with colleagues after the fact. And that recording, as well as presentation slides and other relevant materials, will be made available to you 24 hours post-event today. So keep an eye out in your inboxes tomorrow around noon Eastern for an email with all of those materials. So generally, when we get into a cyber security discussion of this nature, it's helpful to set the landscape a little bit, talk about what we're all seeing and hearing out in the world. So Will, I want to start the conversation with you. The FBI has obviously developed a robust network of task forces, operation centers focused on combating cyber crimes. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the public sector of late in terms of threat actors and adversaries?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the task forces and different kinds of operations centers. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention I'm actually coming to you guys today from the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, which is a public-private partnership founded about 20 years ago between FBI and private sector partners. We actually sit here in Midtown Manhattan with our private sector partners, with folks who are signed up on, agreements to non-disclosure agreements and MOUs to share threat intelligence with each other in real time. That allows the FBI to get information out to our trusted partners, and for them to respond back to us and to each other in a way that speeds up that process. Because we know that cyber crimes can't kind of rely on those traditional law enforcement means of response. So this is, that's part of that, one of these task forces that we create. The government recognizes, the FBI recognizes that we can't be doing this on our own in cyber, that it really has to be a collective approach. And so to your question about some of the threats that we're seeing, the FBI specifically breaks down cybercrime into, or cyber security really, into two parts. There's the nation state cyber adversaries that you might imagine, kind of are like big targets that are mostly focused on, trying to penetrate the US government or private industry. There was a rather significant breach that was disclosed just last night, right? That several executive agencies were targeted by a Chinese intrusion set. And then, so beyond the obvious nation state actors, which we would consider potentially financially motivated, but more likely motivated to gain access to data and proprietary information for the use of that back home. What I specifically work on is our financially motivated cyber criminals. And we've seen some of those traditional actors that we're used to seeing here in that space, everything from our financially motivated fraudsters committing business email compromises, other kinds of cyber-enabled frauds, into our more sophisticated malware actors. Ransomware has certainly continued to be a growing problem in the FBI. And then obviously there's some of the malicious insider cases that we work as well. I would also just want to highlight how we work those romance scam actors, because I think that's pretty helpful. Again, unlike traditional FBI cybercrime or traditional crime in the FBI, where every field office across the United States may work everything. There's a white collar crime squad in every office. What we've done with some of these cyber crimes is setting up centers of excellence. So even if you're a company based in New York, if you are the unfortunate victim of a particular ransomware or a malware set, you may be getting referred out to a different office within the FBI, because those will be the folks that are the experts. And we've done that in a very, very intentional way to build out the knowledge and the capacity to try and tackle those. Rather than having 100 agents in 56 field offices working this, we have 15 dedicated agents in one field office working this to try and understand it and disrupt it. So that's a little bit of how the FBI works some of these threats overall, and I'll try and add in as we go through the rest of the hour on some of the more details of just what our kind of cases and what we're seeing look like.
Awesome, that's a great start. Ben, why don't we transition to you next? Does what Will has sort of mentioned in terms of some of the general threats we're seeing, does this align with what you're seeing in the private sector on the MSP side, or are there other risks and vulnerabilities that we are discovering more frequently that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I think what Will said we're seeing a lot of as well too is kind of all over the place, between business email compromise, account impersonation, resource hijacking, we call it, or even vulnerability exploitation. It's pretty common for customers to get business email compromise on a weekly basis. Strong email defenses are key there, but even endpoint detection as well too is powerful. I think the one that maybe jumps into mind most recently is there's a recent manufacturer vulnerability where it was released on Tuesday, but from the manufacturer, but it was leaked Friday. So everyone is scrambling to patch because the vulnerability is actively being exploited against customer environments. We're seeing that pretty frequently now, and it's a race to get the systems patched before they're exploited by the threat actors.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, James, one of the biggest challenges companies are certainly facing in addressing these types of threats is the vastness of their attack surfaces today. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to have, quote unquote, a limitless attack surface nowadays, and how that's opened up businesses to more risk factors?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. So if you kind of take a step back and think about 5, 10 years ago and where we were, we used to walk into an office, we used to sit at our desk, we had our desktops there, our files were on a file server. We were protected by firewalls, north to south traffic using ACLs to control the north to south traffic. Now that's all gone. And we have cloud adoption that's on the rise. And so it's important to realize that cloud adoption has opened up a whole gamut of opportunities when it comes to bad actors. And if you think about, the old days where it was like we had our files in one spot, now what we're seeing is that cloud adoption's on the rise, but it's not one cloud provider. It's a minimum of 5, it goes up to 100. So your data is distributed, and as part of your attack surface, you're still responsible to protect that data. You can't just walk away and say, well, Microsoft's protecting it, it's not my responsibility. And so also, if you think about the fact that we, because of COVID, it accelerated remote users, more and more folks are working from home. And again, that's expanded that attack surface to a point where it's extremely hard to manage. I'll just also point out, it's also changed the technology stack, right? So my days of MDR, for example, we used to have it so that the product would basically monitor your north to south traffic. Now there is no north to south traffic. Everyone's all over and distributed. So that's definitely complicating your attack surface. And then you've got, mobile devices. People have more than one desktop. They have laptops. And so the other piece that I just want to point out too, when it comes to your attack surface, and this is kind of dear to my heart, which is we got to stop just thinking about the attack surface as it relates to the organization's infrastructure, cloud service offerings, and things like that. Although that's important, it's really your data you're trying to protect, and your attack surface is holds that data. So at the end of the day, you need to be able to understand within your attack surface where that data lies. And I can tell you right now, I've had conversations with CISOs, and data is absolutely everywhere. For example, the recent conversation where someone was working from home, they ended up, their wife was using the same machine. They ended up having a box.com to store personal data, and you save as, and data just is everywhere. So absolutely, the attack surface is more complicated than ever. And then lastly, I'll just say this: we have to start looking at the attack surface in a multi-dimensional manner. You can't just look at it across the board, and certainly discovering it is important, but all has to roll up into risk because it's so complicated. We're never going to be able to stop the attack surface from expanding or for vulnerabilities to be in that attack surface. We have to roll it up into what's your riskiest areas within your attack surface, and how do we remediate and try to lower the risk of a data breach in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think about just in my own home, how many devices we have and connections to different things. It's a lot to keep track of. Will, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, sorry. As James mentioned, like with the last 5 years, right? Like I think about what's changed in the last 5 years.
Uh-oh, your connection froze a little bit.
What's changed in the last perspective of the last 5 years is certainly like the democratization of cybercrime, the ability to get a really powerful tool in your hands. Like we're still like trying to get the thought of like malware as a service out there to people, right? I think there's still a perception in the world that it is like building a car before the concept of the assembly line, and that a cyber actor is sitting at home building this, delivering it, doing all of those things on their own. But what instead can happen now is, even in the last 2 years, right, is that now if I'm writing a piece of code, I can just input it into ChatGPT and say, hey, what did I get wrong here? And it'll tell me what I've done wrong, and now my code is even better. So You go from like a script kiddie who's like maybe able to like make a piece of malware that does what they want to do to attack their high school, or break in and change their grades. This is like a 16-year-old Ferris Bueller style. But now I can create a pretty amazing and sophisticated piece of malware, to the point where we had a 17-year-old a couple years ago in Florida accidentally poison the water supply in their town. I mean, that's the kind of level of stuff we're getting at in the last 5 years that's changed. I say all of that to say, now from the perspective of a defender, what has changed in the last 5 years? What are you doing differently, knowing that all these other things have changed? To use like a sports analogy, if the way that someone's playing offense changes, hopefully you've changed the way your defense is structured too. And if we're not changing to address that, because we're seeing the different ways that this is happening, we're expanding our attack surface, we're making ourselves more vulnerable, and more people are able to do more things to us. If we aren't changing to address that, then we're playing an antiquated version of the game, and we're not likely to maximize our chances of success there.
Yeah, and so just to add to what Will said, which I think is very relevant, 5-10 years ago, I think we saw more targeted attack, probably more nation state, but now cybercrime's on the rise. And to Will's point, these are not sophisticated folks, right? They have it's not targeted, it's they spray and they pray, and they're very, very well organized. They run it like a corporation. And so the fact that our attack surface is expanding and so complicated, they're taking advantage of that, and everyone's a target. You don't need to be a big target anymore. It's everyone. And because at the end of the day, they're just looking to gain some type of financial gain from a lot of folks versus one or two. And I'll just point out the cybercrime, they have one of the best customer support ever. If you have malware issues, you call them, they'll help walk you through how you can get them their money. But it's very sophisticated, but also not very targeted, in the sense of it's organized in a almost like a corporation, but the attacks are more spray and pray type of attacks. And because your attack surface is expanding, we're all vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to Will's point about upping your defenses, right, in the wake of seeing how threats have evolved, perfect segue into what we want to cover next, which is some of those risk factors and the technical capabilities that you really need to have in place to ward off some of these threats. So tools, systems, capabilities are evolving rapidly, and clearly need to, in order to keep up with the sophisticated schemes that are being concocted today. So obviously the ideal scenario is that you've fortified your infrastructure and controls already, so that you're less likely to become the victim of a cyber breach. But assuming at some point that we are all susceptible to a compromise on some level, Ben, can you walk us through some of the core technical layers and components of a security program that are designed to prevent data compromise?
Yeah, absolutely, Kaylee. So James talked about it. Firewalls are fantastic. Firewalls with UTM features are going to prevent a lot of attacks, but that only protects you inside the office if you're behind that firewall. As everyone has moved away from the office, we're working from wherever for various reasons, right? That the attacks on the infrastructure are not focused anymore at that server closet or anything like that. The data, the users work off PCs. So we're seeing those attacks driven more and more there. So endpoint protection is key. A strong EDR platform with a 24/7 SOC monitoring the events that come out of that, making sure that threats are contained so they don't spread, the attackers don't gain footholds in the environment. And when we talk about cloud services, we want all customers to have MFA. We've gotten very, very diligent in deploying this for our clients, and even enhancing MFA to the point where there is a trusted device model, where if your machine does not meet certain health criteria, it's not a company-owned asset, it can't access anything. So we're really limiting the scope of who can access that data, then along with what machine is being used to access that data. And then, kind of the new, we'll say, hotness in the world is ZTNA, Zero Trust Network. And that means many things to different people, where it's at. I talk with our sales team pretty regularly of a customer wanting to deploy ZTNA, and my question back is always, what does that mean to them? what are they trying to achieve, right? That's our job as consultants, to make sure we're delivering a security program to our clients that meets their needs and protects their data. If we focus away from like the physical assets, staff, users, they're the biggest threat, right? PCs don't click on links themselves, they don't browse to websites on their own. So a strong cyber awareness training and continuous phishing program to test end users is key. We do this here, we do it for all of our clients who will work with us to do it. But that continual phishing and then training, if they fail those phishing tests, is a great way to hammer home finding those malicious emails, not responding to that, oh, your mailbox is going to be deleted if you don't give us your password, or go here, well, you need your credentials because you haven't logged in 30 days. Those are generally all malicious, but usually a way for attackers to gain a way into the environment, to learn more about you, to get a password. Now they can start to marry that data together and start harvesting, places that could be tied with your Azure subscription and Azure identity to gain access to systems maybe you don't know about just right away. So it's very important that all those things are then tied together with a kind of a written policy of what has to be done from a policy perspective. The things I just discussed are really kind of the technical controls that meet the written policy, such as the policy says thou shalt not do this, the technical control enforces that. So it's important those two are married together very tightly.
Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned phishing, and I think, more often than not, it seems like that is the likely gateway. Phishing campaigns, email compromise is kind of the entryway for hackers, rogue groups, etc. Will, what's the FBI's perspective on user awareness training and how businesses should be educating and testing their users to make them more aware of these types of threats?
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on something that Ben said too, which is like we do cybersecurity training, right? But we don't ever, it seems too often rather that companies don't sell their cybersecurity as part of why you should want to work with us. Cybersecurity is part of our company, and making that that trust there. So why is it taking us an extra 12 hours to process this payment is because we needed to verify it. And that's the culture of our company, is that we're going to protect your data. We're going to protect this because we have a culture that does that. We in the FBI, we call it Fraud Fridays, because often on a Friday afternoon is when we get one of those complaints in. And it's because get this out before the weekend is a very, very successful tactic that our bad guys use. But if the culture of the company is such that if you wanted to do business with us, you recognize that we were going to be working on a holistic approach towards cybersecurity, knowing that the human element is our weakest. That's one of the selling points of our company, is just how robust our cybersecurity practice is, and it's built into everything we do. So separately on the awareness stuff, I think that we're happy to come out as an organization and do tabletop exercises, working with private sector firms to do exactly this, right? The anatomy of a breach. What does it look like? Having the contact information of your local FBI agent. A huge push from our assistant director of cyber is to have a cyber trained agent within an hour's drive of everyone in this country, so that you have folks who are available to respond to that. Building out what happens, your incident response plan and awareness, so that it's not something you're developing as the situation happens, but that logic tree of, if this happens, then we're going to do this. When you engage law enforcement, when you choose to make that outreach to say we've had an incident, is all part of that kind of plan for when, unfortunately, this is likely to happen. And so we build in a lot of our resources that we can offer is a part of that, like building that plan with you, having a conversation about what a breach looks like, what it looks like when the FBI comes out to respond to an incident like this. So I think it should be a continuous process, as Ben says, like constantly doing the phishing campaigns. I know we do them in the FBI, and I almost got caught on one because it was an email from somebody who was really senior in the FBI, and it says you've missed a deadline for something, and that looked pretty legit until I hovered over the link, and it was one of our phishing tests. It's always embarrassing if you work in cyber and you fall for one of these, but we have to continue to do these things to educate ourselves and to identify those places where we might be vulnerable. So I think the it's an ongoing process of working in a holistic group with your internal, outside, internal and outside counsel. It's working with law enforcement to develop those relationships before it happens, and just continuing to educate employees to make cybersecurity as not just like a part of their job, but as like a selling point for the company.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like that. Yeah, the phishing tests, as sophisticated as obviously phishing schemes have become, the tests are having to, get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more savvy to keep users really aware. Ben, what's the ideal
Sorry, Kaylee,
cadence
can
or
I just add something
or
to what Will said? I
Yeah.
apologize.
No, that's fine.
Because it also relates to the attack surface. So actually, I think the awareness training is interesting as a whole, and we've all been part of it. But what I'm starting to see is a shift into understanding the risk as it relates to the awareness training. So, for example, in your attack surface, if there are folks that have access to certain assets that are worth more than other folks' access to those assets that are in your organization, they will change the awareness training to be different, right? Because that multi-dimensional view is important, and we got to kind of get away from that one-dimensional, everyone gets the same type of training, and start looking at it as it rolls up into what's your actual risk in the organization. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Ben, any thoughts on that or how that plays into how
No,
firms go about
absolutely, and
testing?
that's why we love working with James and his platform, because it takes into account the fact of who you are and what you have access to. So, someone who is, maybe continually fails their phishing tests, if they don't have access to privileged data or anything like that, is there a big risk? Well, there is some, but it's a much greater if someone in HR or the CFO continually fails phishing tests, because they have access to much more sensitive, confidential, valuable data. So that's what's important, and kind of marrying that data set together. And I'm excited to see what James's platform will have in the future for us. I mean, we've been working with them for several years, and as the platform evolves, we're getting insight to who the people are, what they have access to. So that's valuable when managing your data and the risks associated with it when it comes to the cyber controls, and making sure you have really just strong defenses.
Awesome. You guys are teeing up my segues really nicely. So I want to talk about the financial impact, because that is obviously a huge piece of the puzzle when you talk about data breaches and compromises. We can pinpoint specific vulnerabilities and risk factors within your technical environment, your security controls, but it's really compelling to see those risk factors translated into dollars. So James, can you tell us a little bit about how technical gaps can be measured in a way that lets companies actually calculate the financial cost of a potential breach?
Sure. So I'll just point out, what I see as a trend that's happening from a compliance and regulation perspective is we're talking about risk and what's the liability. That's part of the SEC requirements in October. The other piece that I'll say is that it's definitely becoming more of a discussion at the board level. And so the challenge at the board level is the fact that folks that are at that level tend to think of things in dollars and cents, right? And so if you go to the board and you say to them, we have 100,000 vulnerabilities, which I'm not making up that number, companies have 100,000 vulnerabilities, they're not going to understand what to do with that information. So you have to talk the same language as it relates to risk, depending on your audience, to really understand, what the potential liability is for the company. It's just like if you do a financial audit at the board level, that's what they're used to. And so where I see that going is really starting to quantify what your potential breach is at any point in time. And so the other piece that I'll just state, you're never going to be at $0, right? It's not possible. And so there is a little bit of an education at that level to make sure folks understand that there's an inherent risk when you are just on the internet. In doing business, there's an inherent risk. But part of risk management is understanding what risk is acceptable and not acceptable. And that might change over time, because you will want to review this on on a cadence, whether or not it's monthly or quarterly. Usually it's quarterly at that level. And obviously you want to see that risk trending in the right direction, but it's a moving target. You know, we know there's different attacks out there that are happening. And so kind of ending off the, you have to understand the fact that risk management is not going to be zero. You have to talk in their language. You have to quantify what's the potential liability. You have to be able to put guardrails in place to say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. Because then when you're talking about your budget, you know, how much money are you going to spend to remediate and lower your risk, it becomes a lot easier conversation. And you spend X, this is what we think, you know, the risk will be. And then what I'm seeing happening is folks are actually now, they're using cybersecurity insurance as a way of also lowering their risk. So if your liability is, you know, call it $20 million and you're doing all this remediation, you're getting budget to, you know, lower your risk to 10, then you can go out and get a cybersecurity insurance policy for the additional 10. I mean, it doesn't work that way in the real world, but certainly using that type of model helps with the business folks in trying to get their head around, you know, what do you really need to do to lower potential data breach, which is what we're all trying to do in this world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's assume a cyber incident happens, you know, regardless of defenses. What, if anything, does the FBI do at that point to attempt to recover funds that have been stolen or threatened to be stolen, or is the FBI solely focused on just catching the bad guy at that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so much of our like cybersecurity training stops at the moment someone clicks on an email. That's usually where like the presentations end, is like, okay, and then a breach has happened. So as a part of what we do in the first instance is to prevent further victimization to the victim, right? That's kind of our theme throughout any cyber incident that we respond to. And so in the first instance, we have something that's called our rapid response team. We also have a very unfortunately titled the Rapid Asset Recovery Team, which they just call the RAT team. But they, the RAT team and the Rapid Response team, don't know why we needed two, but they are the folks that try and claw that money back for you. So by reporting to the FBI at ic3.gov, that depending on the circumstances can automatically initiate our asset recovery team. And we've spent a lot of time building out that to develop best practices in it. And within the first 72 hours, we are more than 75% successful in clawing money back. And especially if it's still domestic within the United States, we have a much higher chance of getting that money back. We have the ability to serve seizure warrants to get the money back out of bank accounts. But the other thing that we're doing, again, in the model of not trying to impose further damage on the victims, is we would strongly prefer that money get recovered through banking channels, because that means that money is back in your account within a few days. If we have to serve a seizure warrant, then it can take weeks, months. I've had a case where it's gone over a year. So our goal in those instances is to work to try and get that money back, and using that financial portion of this as an opportunity, as another investigative angle to hopefully catch who the bad guy is as well. In a recent case, we worked, just as kind of an example of this, a very large construction project in New York City fell victim to a $47 million business email compromise. And predictably for us, but what might come as quite a shock to you, was all of that money actually went to a little old lady who lives outside of New Orleans, who had set up an LLC for her romantic partner she had met online. And we were able to get 46 and change back. We clawed about as much back as we could. We got about 98% of that money back in the first 48 hours, which I know is the name of a TV show. But I think it's appropriate in cyber crime as well. The remainder of that that is a challenge that we have was converted into cryptocurrency. And that's where our ability to sort of work in those field or in that space is less developed, and it's less assured that we're able to work with those partners, because if it goes to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange, we are just the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so we have to, it really depends on the jurisdiction. So that's just as kind of an anatomy of one of these. We were able to work within traditional banking channels to get almost all of that back, except for the portion that was put into crypto, which thankfully we were able to eventually freeze and is now sitting in a wallet that we had to go through different legal process to get back. And that's when we sort of begin our traditional investigative process of trying to figure out who that person was behind the keyboard who was responsible for this incident in the first place.
Very interesting. So in addition to trying to recoup money that might be lost or stolen, trying to catch the threat actors, obviously regardless of the type of incident or breach, there are a number of steps that businesses internally need to execute as part of the incident response process, in addition to stopping whatever the immediate threat is. Ben, where do you find that companies are typically falling short when it comes to breach response?
Sure. So, obviously stopping the attack, getting the threat actors out of the environment, that's priority number one, containment. Where we see customers fall short is they go from that process right to recovery. And there's a middle step there, which is discovery and forensics, where I see customers fall short. What you're seeing are the symptoms. You see the ransomware deployed. Well, that's great, but that usually doesn't happen within hour one. Usually attackers are there in large environments for days, weeks, months ahead of time. They've more than likely built backdoors into the environment. So when you shut down one account, they can use another one to gain access to your environment. So that discovery and forensics needs to happen. What data did they get access to? Did they take any data? What changes were made? Did they create admin accounts on local PCs because you found their domain admin account and shut that down? When it comes to 365, they may have gained global admin access. Did they grant themselves access to users' mailboxes and have taken data out? Did they create another global admin account? All of this needs to happen versus just cleaning it up. Because if you don't, there's a chance that they're gonna come back again and continue to exploit the business or take further data, or just constantly be there watching. And we see this pretty common. There's a few customers that come to mind, whether it was a ransomware attack or even just an on-prem Exchange server that was just so heavily compromised, we had to rebuild it. That was just the only way to get the threat actors off of that server. So that's it. And the other question we kind of ask customers when we're brought in from an incident response perspective, who's not a current customer, is what do you have for us to work with, right? What tools do you have deployed? Do you have a SIM platform? Are there firewall logs, event logs we can comb through to see if any of these things happen? Otherwise, it's we're digging deep to figure out what they gained access to, how they even got in, how can we shut them down?
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. And nowadays, it seems like in addition to all of the other technical response and communication priorities that a business needs to contend with in the event of a breach, there's now regulatory reporting and disclosure requirements, some of which expect them to report on incidents within just hours of initial discovery. So I want to touch on compliance and regulatory reporting for a minute. Will, let's start with you. There's a lot of pressure from regulatory agencies to report incidents. What role does the FBI play interacting with regulators nowadays?
Yeah, and I touched on this earlier as kind of the theme of an FBI incident response is we're not in the business of re-victimizing someone, and we're not there to assess blame. We're not there. The last thing I ever want to do is be a witness at a civil trial. When one company has sued another for a cyber incident because in some way the FBI has said you're to blame for this. We treat victims of cyber crimes in the same way we treat all victims of crimes. So anything from a violent crime through a financial crime through to a cyber crime, you have rights as a victim, and we treat that very that's one of the most protected pieces of information we have in the FBI, right up there with the identities of our confidential sources, is our victims. And our job is not to come out and say, you should have done this or you should have done that differently. And as a part of that, we are not in the business of referring to regulators anything related to a cyber incident. In the same way that we're also not there to fix your computer, we're not there to say what you should have done differently on it. So our job is to come out there, find those digital artifacts, things that might be helpful. There have in fact been instances where regulators have come out to companies and said, well, I understand you turned that over to the FBI. You should turn that over to us. And we won't be disclosing that to the regulator. That's for the conversation to be had between them. We very intentionally do not have regulators out with us on incident responses because we recognize that that relationship would be very different. And we want our relationship with the victim of a cybercrime to be that of an investigator with the victim of a crime, and not that they feel that there may be some regulatory penalty as a result of cooperation with the FBI.
That's really good to know. I don't know if a lot of folks are aware of that, so that's really helpful. James, one of the agencies that we have been watching closely for the last almost couple years, a year and a half now, is the SEC. They've released a number of proposals specific to cybersecurity, and it looks like now, sometime in the October timeframe, is when we're going to get a final ruling from them as it relates to investment advisors. I know we have a number of financial firms listening in today. What's your perspective on where firms registered with the SEC should focus their time and attention ahead of seeing these final regulations?
Sure, thanks, Kaylee. So going through the SEC Compliance Act, it's a lot of it's very similar to other compliance acts, and in fact, Ben was talking about this earlier, and it's related to NIST, and there's everything that was highlighted in the NIST framework is actually part of the SEC. It's basically making sure you do risk assessments, who has access to your environment, who has access to your assets, who has access to your data, who has accessed that data. So understanding from a forensic standpoint after a breach has taken place, all the way to the table stakes of vulnerability management, which, arguably everyone should be doing. But then, it comes to your processes and controls and things like that. So I would like to argue it's very similar to just best practices, and quite frankly, everyone should be doing that. I think what folks are fussed about is the fact that there's the reporting after the 48 hours, and I think that that's challenging because ultimately you have to tell your customers, and that creates a lot of havoc. And so when do you tell them, and things like that, and then there's the whole record keeping and what records do you actually keep, and so there's a lot of debate what I'm seeing around, even there's language around you have to report what a material breach is, right? So I was in a discussion the other day, actually 2 days ago, and the discussion went, well, if someone gets phished, is that a material breach? Data wasn't compromised, and so I think people are really trying to understand and grasp, what does a material breach, for example, really mean? And ultimately, if we have to report on every single spear phishing type of attack, this is going to be taking up a lot of time and energy, and quite frankly, it could cause a lot of damage to organizations. So the only, I guess, the other piece to this, and this is kind of an interesting one where I was in a debate even 3 weeks ago, it's like you're supposed to report and give information from a record keeping standpoint to the SEC, and it's like, well, they were breached as well, right? So you're effectively giving them private information, and they were breached, and so kind of like, where I see this going is, I think, you got to do your preventative breach best practices, like the stuff that Ben went through. Companies have to do it, whether or not they're doing it themselves or they're leveraging another company to do it for them. You just have to do it. If you're not, then you're not showing that you're doing best practice, and you're effectively not going to be compliant. But when it comes to what is being compliant and not compliant, there's going to be a lot of debate even after October, right? Because the language is just so loose right now. And so when I talk to folks about this, I just basically, it's very obvious. You've got to do the best practice stuff. You've got to show that you're trying. You've got to, show that, from a risk management standpoint, because that's the other thing I see when it comes to all regulatory compliances, they're not talking about vulnerabilities specifically, they're talking about risk, right? And that's that whole multi-dimensional view that I keep talking about, is like, risk is applied differently to different assets, different people in your organizations, and that's that multi-dimensional view that you have to adopt. And again, if you're showing that you're doing the best practices, you're gonna be fine. And so I expect there are going to be a lot of different debates over the next year, and there'll be revisions, but I think it's very normal, and I think it's just it's ultimately a good thing. And I think again, we just got to do all the best practice stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. One specific area that the SEC highlights and that a number of other regulators have taken to calling out is third-party risk management. So we see it a lot on due diligence questionnaires, in cyber liability insurance applications. They're all specifically requiring details on how businesses are relying on third parties and what level of information they have access to, whether it's storage, change management, et cetera. So James, to come to you again, what do regulators and other stakeholders expect to see in today's cyber climate with regard to third-party data access and management?
Yeah, so taking a step back, thinking about your attack surface, arguably it's your organization. We talked about cloud computing. We talked about the fact that folks are working remote and all that good stuff. But the same thing, your employees, we're trying to safeguard and protect that data. Well, if your third party has access to that data or access to your organization, they are actually part of your attack surface, and you have to treat them the same, right? And so, like Home Depot is probably the famous example of the HVAC system got hacked and then they got compromised. Well, at the end of the day, the buck doesn't stop at your organization's DMARC anymore. And so you have to treat them the same. And the way I see it is when you bring on a vendor, they have a DDQ checklist, and they're treating it just like they would any other extension of their organization. The only thing I'd say is, when it comes to compliance, they want to do this on a regular basis because, again, it's a moving target. Things do change. I think there's also a lot of kind of continuous automation that's taking place. I see some companies that are actually demanding third parties to, report the risk management reports to them within a certain cadence. All good stuff. If you bring on a vendor and they're not doing vulnerability management, that's bad, right? It's just something needs to happen. That's your weakest link. So at the end of the day, I think it's common sense, and extending your attack surface and thinking about your third party as an extension is the right way to look at it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that in terms of the scope of how many outsourced business processes you might have within your organization, your technology provider, your accountant, your administrator, you might outsource marketing, finance, payroll. So Ben, as a business, how do I balance the benefits and advantages of outsourcing or co-sourcing these functions with the level of risk I'm incurring as a result of that relationship?
I think it goes back to everything we've just been talking about, which is that risk management, and specifically that those third parties are vendor management, right? And doing due diligence on those companies, those people who have access to your systems. What data are they going to have access to? What are they going to be performing with you? And that's where that risk management and kind of grading comes into play, and asking the questions and asking for evidence of what are their cyber controls, their policies, even HR practices. How are we going to hold this vendor accountable for performance, for security, if they do something wrong? If they breach our data, what type of insurance do they have? Do they have enough coverage to protect our data and make us whole if they are basically the person responsible for the breach? And there's different ways to do that. There's third-party independent reports such as an ISO or a SOC 2, where a third party is hired to come in and conduct that investigation on the entity. And we do that. We undergo a SOC 2 Type 2 audit every single year, and that's used we share that with all the clients that we work with who ask for it, because it really speaks to our policies and procedures, not just cyber, right? That's very important, but HR, the background check process, incident response when there is an incident, what do we do, right? When it comes to alert monitoring, reporting, vulnerability management, that speaks to us. That's it's an advertisement really to Omega as a business of how we conduct ourselves internally as well as working with clients. When we talk about those individuals outsourced, there are technical controls you can put in place too to restrict. Don't allow them, don't give them copies of your data. Make them use your systems. Which that's a higher expense if you have to provide a VDI or a PC for them to work off of. But don't email them a copy of your QuickBooks backup. That's one simple way you think about it like that. Right? Give them a PC they remote into so the data can't be copied. It never leaves your doors. Then you just have to be concerned about the system they're using to access that PC. And there's a myriad of ways we can kind of solve this riddle, but it comes back to risk management and tolerance and partnering with the right vendor. We have organizations that, they're working with one partner, but because of their growth, their requirements, they have to move on to other parties because they can't meet their requirements. And we do the same thing when we bring on vendors internally or to partner to offer services to our clients. We have a very stringent and rigid vendor management process, which I think James can attest to. But part of that is the SOC 2. All this stuff ties back to risk management, and it's your job as the organization administrator, whoever's responsible for it, to be thorough and conduct that in-depth assessment before you allow people into your network and access to your data.
Ben, I absolutely, you said folks are basically from a third party perspective using their systems, like for example, their EDR, or they're extending it. I absolutely see that today.
Yep.
And I think that's good, because that's that actual extension of your attack surface. Thinking of the supply chain as part of your organization, and basically under that umbrella from a best practice standpoint, whatever it is you're doing is absolutely what I think is the right thing to do. And I certainly see a lot of companies going that route.
Absolutely.
Great. Do a quick time check here. We've got, it looks like about 7 or 8 minutes left until the top of the hour. So just a couple more questions we want to try to get to, and then we'll wrap things up. Kind of want to look ahead. So threats are constantly evolving. Hackers are becoming savvier, or at least more desperate, it seems, as each day passes. What trends are you expecting to see over the next 12, 18, 24 months that we're going to start hearing more about?
Yeah, and they're becoming more effective too. In the FBI's Internet Crime Complaints Center annual summary, which I believe we're going to share after this, one of the key takeaways is that we received a statistically significant amount of fewer complaints this year in 2022 than we did in 2021, but hackers made several $billion more in that year. So the average cost of a cyber incident continues to get more damaging to the individual or the company that's affected. I mentioned it earlier, but I also think that it's the democratization of cybercrime around to more actors who are more capable of doing more bad things more easily, which is, I guess, the role of the FBI agent in most panels, is to just scare everybody. But that is what we're seeing, and I think we're seeing that spreading to, we're not just worried about 3 nation state actors anymore. It's kind of expanded out into several different nation states that might have different intentions and motivations, but also on the criminal side, the 5th most popular language on the dark web is Portuguese. I think that's rather interesting. And in the last few years, we've seen a huge emergence of bank fraud targeting Brazil. So I think South America has long been an ignored or forgotten or at least neglected portion of what we're seeing in cyber. But our organization internally is receiving a tremendous amount of asks for our training and our expertise down there, so much so that we are dedicating a full-time agent to Brasilia to work cyber with the Brazilian partners. So I think that's just an example of where we're seeing this kind of attack surface expanding. I also think we've touched on it, and I know James has some good opinions on this, but we're seeing the way that AI is going to just continue to change the effectiveness of our scams. One of the key things we do in our phishing examples, right, is we look for that that poorly written email. Like those are probably going to go away because now I can use ChatGPT to proofread me. So I think a lot of those issues that are good for us to spot and assess when we're looking at our potential phishing emails might become a lot more difficult to test because I can get a body of someone's work, their words, and make an email that actually sounds like them, right? I can ask, an AI to do that for us. So yeah, I think those are just like a couple of ways that we're seeing this change. I want to be sensitive to time and let James jump in on that too, because I think we've mentioned just in passing offline some of the stuff that we're seeing with AI.
Yeah, James, you want to jump in? Your thoughts on
Sure.
ChatGPT and how that's going to impact security and compliance down the line?
Yeah, and I think we have to break it out into in practice and in theory, right? So ultimately, AI is going to change the cybersecurity space as a whole. There's no doubt. I would argue it's what's scarier is AI and quantum computing, right? Because if you think about encryption and what we use on our every day when we're logging into our bank, triple DES or whatever it might be, at the end of the day, you can break that encryption with quantum computing, and then you get the intelligence of AI, and bad stuff happens. But going back to in theory, I think ultimately we're going to see that, and Will talked about this. The linear model where AI starts to affect cybers, it's literally going to be that linear model where humans make mistakes. We that will kind of go away as that linear model goes up. I think it's interesting to think about from even external hacking in standpoint, like even from a pen test standpoint, right? So pen tests are done wildly different every time, right? And why? It's because at the end of the day, the bad actors are humans, right? They're using a subset of tools to scan your environment, get your IPs, and they're using spear phishing and things like that. But ultimately, what happens is it just becomes more effective with AI, and it becomes faster, right? So you're going to see that there's just going to be ultimately more type of attacks because it's going to be automated, right? And so I do think from an AI standpoint and taking a step back, there's always going to be a human factor to a certain extent for a certain period of time. But absolutely, over the next, call it 3 to 5 years, those types of attacks are just going to become more effective. There's going to be more of them, less human involved in them. You think about, what's taking place, like if you've ever, had a spear phishing attack, it's literally someone overseas, and they run it like a business, like I said before. Well, that human's not going to actually do the hard, heavy lifting, right? It's going to be AI, and that human's going to be more effective and focused on the lower hanging fruit. Where's the bigger target? So it's going to affect the landscape. It's going to affect cybersecurity, and I think that ultimately we just have to be smarter. And I bring it back to the compliance and regulation. Like if we're not doing the best practice stuff, you're a weak link. And so all the stuff that Ben talked about in that NIST slide, all the stuff Will talked about when it comes to awareness training, these are all table stakes, quite frankly. And in order for us to guard against AI in the future, we've got to do it. Compliance and regulation come out, and we think it's a nuisance, and arguably we could say that there's some turmoil and some overhead, but we're just trying to do the right thing. Everyone's just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we are just at the 1 o'clock mark here. I do still want to give folks the opportunity if they want to submit a question. We may not be able to address it immediately. However, I will pass along any questions that we receive to our speakers, and I'm also going to be providing their contact information if you want to reach out to any of them directly. But I'll give folks a couple minutes here if they do want to submit a question, and I'll sort of use that opportunity to pose one final question to you guys, our speakers. We've covered a lot. There's a lot to consider, but perhaps there are some folks listening that, don't or won't have the budget or resources to implement a complete comprehensive cyber risk program, tomorrow. So for them or for businesses looking ahead to next year's IT budget planning process, what is your recommendation for maybe the single most important safeguard or control or tool or practice they can implement or enhance to protect them from the modern threats that face us today? Ben, I'll come to you first because you're first on my camera screen.
Okay, thanks, Kaylee. I'm going to push back a little bit. And I don't think there's one single most important safeguard or control or anything any of us can do, any organization can do. Right? There's no silver bullet anymore in technology. I remember when I started my career, you didn't have a firewall then. You had a modem, and if you had Norton AV, you were good. Like that was it. That's all you needed, right? And here we are 20 plus years later, and we're talking about next gen firewall, MFA, all these technologies that have basically just exploded because technology has advanced, right? Attackers have advanced, right? So there's not one thing you can do anymore. I'm going to give you the IT answer for everything is that it depends, right? It's situational. It depends on the business's current cyber, their IT, their maturity, and even coming back to the risk register. What is the highest risk to the business, and is that mitigated? If not, that's where the focus should be. We talked about this earlier. The focus years was the IT infrastructure, the servers, that gear running in the closet, in the data center. That's really kind of changed, and the threats, the attacks are targeted against the users now, not the infrastructure, right? So you got to focus on really the people. What do they have access to, and what's the value of that data, right? If you're going to stop a breach or prevent a breach, you have to know what you have, you have to quantify it, and you have to know the risks around it.
Fair enough. All right, James, how about you? What's your take on what folks should focus on?
Yeah, so as it relates to budget, I think ultimately that's an ongoing discussion. I think we have to look at your attack surface in that multi-dimensional view. And so traditionally speaking, we've looked at it as an organization, and we do the same type of cadence and same type of best practices across the board. However, Ben said, highlight your risks and mitigate. That's exactly what we should be doing, even outside of the budget conversation, right? So understanding where your riskiest points are in your organization, whether or not it's the assets or the people. And from my perspective, what I see a lot of is it's the data that you're trying to protect. So you've got to understand where your data is in order to protect it, right? If you don't understand it, how are you going to protect it? And also from a record keeping standpoint, if you were breached, how do you know which data was actually breached? And so if you look at it in that multi-dimensional view in what Ben said, which is highlight your riskiest aspects of your organization and mitigate or remediate, ultimately that's going to be a better bang for your buck when it comes to your budget. But ultimately, this is part of compliance as well, right? This is part of that whole risk management piece that we keep talking about. And so you're going to still check the box from a compliance standpoint and do the best practices to protect your data in your organization.
Great. Last but not least, Will.
Yeah, I think just briefly, it's to highlight what both Ben and James said. It's limiting the ability. There's a lot of things you can do that are low cost or no cost. So limiting the ability of an attacker to move laterally within your space, so you know where, once they got in and you know what they're after or where they are in your network, you know they can't get elsewhere because you've done what you can to prevent that. Right? It's those are some easy low cost things. It's constantly double checking, triple checking what people have access to. Is there a reason why our HR folks also have access to the back end? There's it's just, constantly going back and doing those threat assessments that you can do to prevent unintentional risk, unnecessary risk that you don't need to take. And then once you have to decide what those risks are, because obviously, like, we have to be on the internet to do business. So now we know we have to do that. Then what are we opening ourselves up to, and how can we best limit whatever exposure we have to maximize our chance of detecting it if it comes in, and minimize the attacker's ability to make best use of that. There are other just kinds of like best practices that have been highlighted here in terms of the Zero Trust Network, and just building out a system that allows you to continue to minimize how exposed you are to those threats. That doesn't cost anything. It's those are the kind of the, I would say it's like the saying, like, good manners don't cost nothing, right? It's like good cybersecurity practices and hygiene don't have to cost a lot. And then once you decide where your risks are most housed, that's when you look to spend some of that money on whatever that tool is that helps you prevent the most likely source of infection.
That's a good point. All right, well, we have gone over our allotted time, so I know we didn't really get to leave an opportunity for questions here, but I will pass along any that we receive, and all of this contact information that you guys see on your screens will be shared in our follow-up email, so you'll have access to reach out to our speakers directly if there are other questions or concerns that you'd like to get in touch with them on. So as a reminder, tomorrow you will receive an email from me with a link to this replay recording, as well as our presentation slides, the cybercrime report that we'll reference, and some other materials that might be relevant to you on cybersecurity and compliance. Certainly, please feel free to respond to that email as well. If you have questions, I'm happy to pass those along on behalf of anyone. I want to personally thank the three of you for joining us and sharing your expertise for the last hour. So thank you to Ben, James, and Will for joining us today. And certainly last but not least, thank you to everybody who dialed in and joined us. And we hope to see you all for another webinar soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Kaylee.
Thank you all.
See you, gentlemen.